Hello, everyone. Can you hear me all right? Great. Lovely. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming out tonight to the VCUarts lecture series. My name is Catherine Roach, and I'm an associate professor in the art history department. And it's my great honor tonight to introduce our speaker, Tobias Wofford. Tobias is an associate professor here in the art history department. He holds a Ph.D. from UCLA. And his research on the art of the African diaspora and the art of the United States has been supported by numerous fellowships. Some I will mention are the Center for Advanced Studies in the Visual Arts, Johns Hopkins, and the Getty. And he's also just finishing his term as chair of the art history department. And I would like to take this opportunity on behalf of all the faculty to thank Tobias for his service. Um, Truly, it is a mark of a true accomplishment that one can finish one's term at chair and have even more admiration from your fellow faculty members than you did when you started. And that is very much the case here. So thank you, Tobias, and we look forward to seeing what you're going to do with your upcoming research leave. And tonight, Tobias will be sharing stories from his landmark exhibition that he co-curated at the Smithsonian American Art Museum titled The Shape of Power, Stories of Race and American Sculpture. Please join me in welcoming Tobias.
Thank you, Kate, for that really sweet and thoughtful introduction. And thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, VCUarts and the ICA for inviting me to share this project and research. It is a work that has been especially enriching experience for me because curating is a particularly collaborative way of doing art history. And this project was especially so. So and notice I'm wearing the same jacket, but what are you gonna do? I'm dressing up for you as I dressed up for them on our opening. I've been honored to work over a number of years closely with brilliant co-curators, Karen Lemmy, the Lucy Rahm Curator of Sculpture at SAM, the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and Grace Yasamura, Assistant Curator at SAM. Together, working in partnership with museum specialists across SAM, including the brilliant Anne Showalter, head of interpretation, and interpretation specialist Lexi Labina, exhibition designer Sarah Gray, and catalog editor Juliana White, I've had an opportunity to learn and think deeply in community. And the spirit of collaboration that began with the exhibition extended beyond the museum to include a scholarly advisory council and collaborations with Howard University faculty and students and George Mason University students from the Native American and Indigenous Student Alliance, as well as their faculty advisor, Gabby Tyak. And I wanted to acknowledge them all at the beginning of this talk. The Shape of Power, Stories of Race in American Sculpture, thinks of sculpture as a vital portal into conversations about the histories of race and racism in the United States. It suggests that sculpture and race have long been intertwined throughout the history of this country. The exhibition contains 82 objects by 70 different artists, artworks ranging from monumental in scale to pocket-sized coins. The works in the exhibition were created over more than 2 centuries, ranging from 1792 to 2023. And across this time period, the artworks tell powerful stories about the ways in which sculpture has always been used to give, or the ways in which sculpture has been used to give physical form to concepts of race, to assert and propagate racial hierarchies, and make present conceptions of others for viewers to see. Still, other artists have embraced the medium as a means to challenge racial hierarchies, to assert powerful expressions of self that complicate and interrogate established notions of racial difference, and to project new possibilities in identity. The exhibition isn't organized chronologically. Rather, it focuses on sites of encounter, from physical sites such as the home or official public spaces like plazas, to conceptual sites such as the family or community or the future. Brought together in dynamic juxtaposition, the hope is that each work has the potential to deepen our understanding of the past and the present. One of the important aspects of the show is to provide an opportunity for viewers to think critically about the ways in which we interpret and experience sculpture. For me, the core of art history is the idea that artworks do not only represent their subject, but are also wrought through with the ideologies from which they are made and circulate and are experienced. I think of, for example, the writings of early African American art historian Freeman Murray, who wrote one of the earliest book-length treatises on sculptural representations of African Americans in his self-published 1916 volume, Emancipation and the Freedmen, or Emancipation and the Freed in American Sculpture, a Study and Interpretation. He introduced his monograph by emphasizing the importance of interpretation in the experience of sculpture, unpacking the intertwined relations of intention, meaning, and effect. Murray argued that while Black folk want to see themselves recognized, especially in public spaces, representations in sculpture is wrought with dynamics of power that require a critical attentiveness to such depictions. He wrote, quote, "I can hardly press too strongly the importance of careful, perspicacious interpretation. I am convinced that, for Black folk in America, at least, this is of paramount importance. Under the anomalous conditions prevailing in this country, any recognition of Black folk in artworks which are intended for public view, is apt to be pleasing to us. But it does not allow that every such recognition is creditable and helpful. Some of them, indeed, are just the opposite." For Murray, artistic representation and viewer's interpretation join in a crucial meeting of art, power, and politics. Careful and critical understanding of the artworks, of the workings of such representation, is thus as important an important part of viewing art and central to the art historian's role. Expanding beyond Murray's use of the term, recognition is useful when describing encounters with sculpture in a racialized social field because it suggests a moment of interpellation, where, as described by theorists like Louis Althusser and Judith Butler, an encounter with a representative of power prompts us to identify in relation to it. To recognize sculpture and interpret it through its entanglement in a social field or in a field of social relations is like everyday interpretation of racialized bodies, facial features, skin tones, and hair textures that we, as Americans, are trained in social contexts to do without even thinking. If we apply that training to sculpture while maintaining what Murray described as the importance of careful, perspicacious interpretation, perhaps we might also recognize the intense interrelation between sculpture and race in the United States and the underlying structures of power through which conceptions of race are created and circulate. This can help us look through the works, reinforcing powerful ideologies inherent in sculptures like Daniel Chester French's monumental Four Continents from the first decade of the 20th century, the maquettes of which are included in The Shape of Power. In the Four Continents, French employed long-standing tradition of dividing the peoples of the world into the geographic regions of Europe, Asia, Africa, and America. As a part of a taxonomic system developed in the 15th century age of exploration, and which has increasingly served as a foundation for techniques of science and sciences of racialization well into the 20th century. Through using muses meant to stand in for each continent, numerous symbols are mobilized and produce stereotypical understandings of difference between the continents and their people, including the rendering of Africa in a perpetual state of sleep, as seen here. We might also approach with a critical eye the ways in which sculpture has been mobilized to give physical form to spurious scientific concepts, as with Malvina Hoffman's creation of 104 life-size sculptures for the race of mankind, which was commissioned by Chicago's Field Museum of Natural History. The exhibition proposed to display and categorize humanity through a deeply discredited eugenicist lens and its concepts were circulated in smaller casts, including the one displayed in The Shape of Power, and in forms of atlases and maps, such as the one seen here. In the exhibition, we include information about the myth of biological race, as well as a 1969 letter by Leroy Jones demanding that the sculptures and the maps be taken down and discontinued, revealing in many ways the ways in which these ideas were resisted even in their earlier instances. Since the 1960s, the relationship between race and representation has been an increasingly central concern for many of the most evocative American artists working in the medium of sculpture. The rise in countercultures of the 1960s and 1970s saw liberation movements such as the Black Power movement, the American Indian movement, and the Chicano movement. Though often most poignantly expressed in methods of resistance and active expression, artists working to create images of pride look to various conceptions of race to achieve self-definition and new modes of sculptural representation. One example in The Shape of Power is Luis Jimenez's 1969 sculpture, Man on Fire, which presents one of the most compelling reflections on the histories of modernism as well as on racialization of Chicanx communities in the United States. The life-size figure is rendered in Jimenez's signature slick, super-finished surfaces reminiscent of the airbrushed lowriders that emerged in post-war Mexican-American communities. It depicts a nude man standing with his arms drawn back and his head bowed in determination, even as he is engulfed in red, orange, and yellow flames, fed by a block of wood at his feet. Standing on a stark white plinth, the work mirrors the verticality of monumental American sculptures like Frederick Auguste Barthold's Statue of Liberty, or Hiram Powers' 1848 sculpture America, which uses the classicized language of ancient Greek and Roman sculpture to present a white woman who stands in as a muse for the national body, a mode of representation that was widely standardized in American sculpture. In contrast, Man on Fire's dense layering of inspirations reflect very different notions of identity and monumentality. The idea of the man engulfed by flames was inspired by the Mexican modernist Clemente Orozco's 1939 Hombre de Fuego, painted on the chapel of a dome in Guadalajara, Mexico. Jimenez's work invokes both Orozco's Promethean figure as well as a historic indigenous Aztec ruler, Cuauhtemoc. Sorry, I knew I was going to ruin that. Who was tortured with fire for his resistance to Spanish colonization of Mexico. Yet the image of a man on fire was also held contemporary political significance for Jimenez. It referenced the famously shocking self-immolation of Buddhist monk Thich Quang Duc in protest against the U.S.-backed South Vietnamese regime in 1963. In preparatory drawings, Jimenez depicted the figure seated like the monk. However, Jimenez also turned to erect figures such as the Black and Puerto Rican youth he had seen throwing Molotov cocktails during riots and protests in New York. Fire, thus, emerges as a potent symbol of both racialized violence and of resistance and self-determination. Along with these various inspirations, the work was also an opportunity for Jimenez to think of his own identity, as he considered Man on Fire to be a self-portrait that emphasized his his features as a brown indigenous American. Although through its layered reference, Man on Fire embodies an alternate discourse of racialization, laying claim to Chicano belonging in the United States. As curator and art historian E. Carmen Ramos described it, quote, Jimenez's brown figure relates to Chicano indigenism, which asserted the native identity of Mexican Americans and laid claim to the community's roots in the historic Southwest in lands that were formerly part of the Mexican state and its pre-conquest cultures, end quote. As a figure that embraces indigeneity and celebrates the protest of Black and Puerto Rican activists, Man on Fire raises communities often excluded in monumental landscapes. In this respect, the work can also be considered a precursor to community-based public sculpture projects like John Ahern and Rigoberto Torres's, or those of John Ahern and Rigoberto Torres. Ahern and Torres's sculptural practice explicitly explicitly engages with the meeting of power and representation in public spaces, where discourses of race and access to image making are placed at the fore. In the late 1970s, Ahern began his sculpture practice through making plaster casts of members of his South Bronx community. These works were often done in the streets with sitter volunteers informing how they would be represented. Ahern joined up with fellow Bronx artist Rigoberto Torres in 1981 to create a range of painted casts portraits that would be placed in public spaces of the community. An example such as his highly lauded South Bronx Hall of Fame, Ahern and Torres celebrated the Black and Latinx community of the Bronx by facilitating local participation and creating local monuments rooted in the communities of color they represent. As a sculptural practice that relies on the trust and participation of the sitters, Ahern and Torres's work has been interpreted as a profound social commentary. The success of their community-focused projects was largely due to privileging collaboration with those represented over the artist's own visions of monumentality. The examples in the shape of power were created in collaboration with the Washington Project for the Arts and originally shown in Washington, D.C. in 1992 at the Congress Heights Public School. The resulting sculptures were lauded by critics as a powerful and compassionate means to allow the local community to see themselves represented. In this sense, Ahern and Torres's work is inherently responsive to the communities in which they are located and present an inversion of the standard power relations in public sculpture, where the representational decisions are often made by those in power, and the resulting monuments are almost always depict exceptional figures who are usually white. As art historian Mi-Wan Kwan wrote of Ahern's community-based projects in her text on site-specific art, quote, Ahern attempted to resist the function of site-specific public art to support the ideologies and political power of dominant social groups, affirming instead his allegiance to those groups disempowered and marginalized by these ideologies and power. However, Ahern and Torres's practice also reveals unspoken lines in the dynamics of race and representation in public art. The most famous example is Ahern's solo project to create a series of public bronze statues set in the traffic triangle in the Bronx. Supported by the Percentage for Art program in New York City's Department of Cultural Affairs. Using his method of public engagement rooted in local community, Ahern chose to represent members of his neighborhood who were not normally considered model citizens. In the end, he created 3 full-length painted bronze sculptures of 33-year-old Raymond Garcia with his pit bull, 24-year-old Corey Mann, who has a boombox, and 14-year-old Delisha, each standing on a cement plinth in the statue park. With its celebration of marginalized community members, the work was much like others Ahern had created. Yet a swift backlash by the Black community members challenged Ahern's choice of models and questioned whether the white artist was qualified to represent the primarily Black and Latinx community, despite the fact that the artist lived just blocks from the traffic triangle in question. At the root of these critiques was the artist's choice to monumentalize community members who experience incarceration, unemployment, or housing insecurity, people who some considered menacing presences in their community. Some locals accused the works of being racist and using pejorative stereotypes to degrade the working class urban neighborhood. In some ways, this episode recalls us subtleties of recognition raised by Freeman Murray, who argued that merely being represented in public space is not enough for Black folk who rarely see themselves depicted in such settings. He calls for special or careful attention to interpretation of such racialized representations. Yet the very rarity of such public works also produces an unrealistic demand that sculpture be representative of complex and multifaceted communities. In response to the critiques from the community, Ahern removed the sculptures from the park. As Kwan has explored, this episode reveals the tangled workings of power centered on public sculpture and exposes the limits of community as well as the limits of representation. Even more, Ahern and Torres's work suggests how much race is an active and constitutive force in debates over community and representation in the United States. It exposes the fact that representation is read not only through the racial identity of who is depicted, but also through the race of the artist creating the representation. Alliances of community in the United States are bounded by geography, race, and class, and when those boundaries are unclear or blurry, public sculpture can be a volatile catalyst for controversy. Arguably because of the limits of representation through the figure, some artists have turned away from explicit representation and toward abstraction. Yet, as explored by scholars such as Ann Gibson and others, the implications of abstraction and representation in the work of women and artists of color were often not incorporated into the unfolding history of American art until recent decades. Reading abstract work through the lens of race would help us to recognize important nuances and representation at stake in the works of artists such as Barbara Chase Rubu and Melvin Edwards. Chase Rubu began her sculptural practice in the late 1950s, and through a considered working of texture, surface, and form, she developed an abstract sculptural style that juxtaposed cast and folded metal forms against soft materials like wool and silk. When it comes to representation, Chase Rubu's strategy is one of suggestion and feeling rather than outright depiction, more poetry than prose. And in fact, the artist is also a poet, and works such as her Zanzibar Black, which is part of the museum's collection and included in Shape of Power, glosses the artist's poem, Why Did We Leave Zanzibar? The work is composed of a large black mass of folding and rippling metal forms that together create a sense of a tall torso topped with a small square head. This head wears a necklace of black rope, while below a skirt of flowing and knotted skeins of black wool and silk cascade and puddle on the floor. Zanzibar Black both eschews the expectations of sculptural order by using the soft yarns to support the heavy metal forms, while still maintaining a vertical monumentality. The poem that inspired the piece is layered and impressionistic as layered and impressionistic as the sculpture. It invokes imagery of violence and survival through the context of slavery on the island of Zanzibar, a center of the slave trade in the Indian Ocean. In this sense, the work casts its inspiration across the African diaspora, just as the ending of the lines of the poem suggest, quote, casting up that bottle-wrapped question flung into the sea by some desperate hand so many murders ago. Why did we leave Zanzibar? End quote. Works like Zanzibar Black challenge the capaciousness of modernist claims about universal abstraction. Indeed, they challenge us to think critically about modernity itself. Our understandings of modernity must encompass not only the triumphant narratives of technology, nations, and global connection, it must also account for the many forms of violence that enable those systems, from ecological destruction to slavery and forced refugees. A holistic account of modernity must relay the experience of trauma and survival invoked in Chase Roubeau's poem, and that lurk in the dark folds and complex knots of Zanzibar Black. A similar invocation of diaspora and activism through abstraction can be seen in Melvin Edwards's abstract works like his 1993 Tambo, which presents a poetic accumulation of found and welded metal implements. Edwards began his career in Los Angeles in the 1960s among a group of LA-based artists such as Betty Saar, Ed Burrell, and Ed Kienholz, among others, who all engaged with sculptural assemblage by manipulating meaningful symbols of modern and popular material culture. Edwards created assemblages of welded steel and industrial metal implements that similarly undergird modernity. In Tambo, he used found tools such as a shovel, wrench, chains, and a sharp spear, as well as an I-beam. The work is an homage to the South African leader Oliver Tambo, who rose from meager beginnings in a farming village to become the president of the African National Congress and a key revolutionary figure in the fight against apartheid. Created in 1993, after the end of apartheid and during the transition to a democratic South Africa, the tools are fitting examples of the objects that could be effective and deadly weapons in the context of revolutionary struggle, but that are also necessary in the building and farming once peace is achieved. Mirroring the need for adaptation and improvisation in the resisting of racism and building of a just society, many of the components in Edwards' complex compositions invoke multiple interpretations, some hopeful and some frightening. Edwards's abstraction turns attention away from the racialized body as a fulcrum for representation and towards the implements and objects that surround experience in a racialized society. Much like Chase Roubeau's abstraction, they provoke a serious reflection on Black experiences of modern life. While the found objects and materials welded into his works may be read as tools that forge modern life, hammers, chains, barbed wire, etc. There are also implements of coercion and racist violence seen in slavery and lynching, as well as the means of resistance for Black people claiming autonomy and freedom within the story of modernity. The abstraction that Edwards achieves was noted by many as connecting poignantly to Black experience. Yet importantly, locating the race and identity of abstract works like those by Edwards and Chase Rubu was a major point of debate, especially at the height of identity movements of the 1970s and the multiculturalism of the 1980s and 1990s. While white critics wrote off identity-oriented works that did not meet their conceptions of universality in art, some Black critics did not see abstract works as meeting their desire for an active and revolutionary image that clearly expressed racial pride and uplift. Critic Amiri Baraka, or Leroy Jones, for example, saw the abstraction of artists of color as a complete turn away from Black communities. The recurring debates about the legibility of race and identity in these abstract works of artists like Edwards and Chase Rubu reveal a lot about the stakes of representation for artists of color in American art. The fact that Black critics wanted to see explicit expressions of identity in abstract works reflect the enduring impact of historical lack of access to representation for these artists and their audiences. And it shows the constant work that artists of color have had to do to battle the insidious archive of racist representations in American culture. The result has been an obsession in communities of color with the good image that depicts or embodies racial uplift, and a resistance to the polysemous nature of abstraction, as Lee Rayford has recently explored. This obsession with positive images was in some ways underlying Murray Freeman's desire for a critical analysis of representation, but such demands also run the risk of reifying race through policing the boundaries of identity with tropes of authenticity. As British art historian Coben Mercer explored in his essay Black Art and the Burden of Representation, such policing of representation carries its own forms of violence and exclusion. Many artists have used sculpture to challenge the language of race through which we are supposed to position ourselves in American society. Because sculpture shares physical space with viewers, the medium gives artists a unique opportunity to reflect on the processes of identification as an embodied experience, or what theorists have referred to as interpolation. In doing so, such artists have proposed new forms of embodiment that resist or subvert restrictive categories of race in the United States. Examples such as Alison Saar's work Mirror Mirror, Mulatta Seeking Inner Negress reflect an extremely interior and personal search for self within a deeply racialized society. Her using her powerful technique of carved wood that is then often coated with hammered tin and copper sheets, Sarah created an almost life-size sculpture of a young nude woman looking into the black bottom of an iron skillet that she holds as if it were a mirror, and a face is molded onto the skillet. Indeed, it is staring back at her. The black skillet stands in striking contrast to the whitewashed tin studded with nails that serve as the woman's dermis. Mirror Mirror suggests a notion of a self that is engaged with the interpolation of race into or so central to American experience. Yet racial identity represents a friction in the signifiers of race expected to be read on an individual's body, on the individual's body itself. As the daughter of a famed African American artist, Betty Saar, Alison Saar grew up with the critical language of art and race. Her own work of carved wood and found objects often center on figures of women and draw upon African and African diaspora traditions to create a unique language of identity and feminism. As a white presenting biracial artist, Sarr feels her African heritage is often not immediately apparent to a casual day to day encounter. She discussed Mirror Mirror as one means to think through the complexity of that identity. Quote, I was hyperconscious of the African American side of my ancestry. Just because being perceived as white or looking white, that was always something that I struggled with, end quote. Thus, Sarr raises a story that echoes what Francophone psychiatrist and political philosopher Frantz Fanon described as interpolation with race in his seminal 1952 book, Black Skin, White Masks, and exposes how common the disruptive and discordant experience of racialization in American life can be as one works to find oneself in the complex American story. Another extraordinary interrogation of racialized identity and the history of sculpture is made through Young-Jun Kwak's powerful project Spartan Ruin, out of which the artist created Divine Ruin My Face Bronze, included in the Shape of Power. Kwak is best known for her performance-based practice and collaborative projects such as Mutant Salon, which offers spaces of self-care and connection for queer, trans, people of color, and other communities. Kwak created her project Spartan Ruin while on a residency at Michigan State University. Like many college and university campuses around the nation, Michigan State is home to public sculptures that merge into everyday life of its students. The Michigan campus is dominated by a sculpture of an ancient Greek Spartan, the school mascot, created by Michigan State professor Leonard Jungwirth in 1945 in a monumental Art Deco style. Sparty, as the work is nicknamed by students, dominates the campus and is absorbed into all sorts of campus rituals. In the wake of the 2017 movements to question Confederate monuments on college campuses, Kwak took the opportunity to consider how sculptures like Sparty become intense sites of community identity and sometimes locuses for violence and exclusion. Kwak engaged intimately with the towering figure, creating a series of rubbings of this sculpture's surface. Sparty's facial features were rubbed into mask-like drawings, and sections of the sculpture's body were cast and reworked into artifact-like fragments. Finally, she created new objects encrusted with crystals and rhinestones, exaggerating or altering the highly gendered elements of the sculpture. Kwak's imprints and casts interrogate the artifice of the sculptural representation, as Sparty's surfaces were produced according to a language of monumental sculpture that was largely standardized across the nation to affect various surface-level emotions and attachments for viewers without requiring deep contemplation. Kwak's careful tracing encourages deeper looking, as art historian Karen Sietzowitz described, quote, displayed with strong light, casting deep shadows, Young-Jun's work encourages the slow, contemplative engagement that is not typically afforded in Youngworth's public monument. Kwak's close attention to the material form of Spartan offers its own kind of visual pleasure, but it also reveals the separation between that form and its outsized symbolic meaning, end quote. The interactions with Sparty probe the question, what aspects of these monumental works, placed in public spaces around the nation, do we use to inscribe our own identities? This query extends as a through line through many of the works in the shape of power. And as a tentative response, Kwok included the work Divine Ruin, My Face, which we were lucky to enough to have in shape of power. While most of the Spartan Ruin series are casts of the sculpture, and thus indexes of an icon, Kwok's Divine Ruin is a direct cast of her own face. It takes the form of a half of an abstracted, head-sized egg shape, whose shell is encrusted with shimmering crystals. Hanging from the ceiling, the interior of the shell reveals the upside-down cast of Kwok's face in metallic bronze, whose veristic imprint is only made visible by a strong spotlight shining from above. The light cast against the metal surface confounds the viewer's depth perception, as the face seems at once to protrude and recede from its jeweled shell. This play with the expectation also challenges viewers to think about their embodied encounter with sculpture, which is so deeply raced and gendered as an experience. With its jeweled shell splashing sparkled light into the room, the work is both protective while maintaining a vulnerable and intimate interiority that we might think of along the lines of subjectivity. If Divine Ruin offers a means to consider the intimate encounter, works like those by Glenn Kino suggest a means to connect it to communal action, as with his 2013 Untitled Bridge. The work hangs from the ceiling in a long, undulating row of identical gold-leafed right arms stretched out horizontally, each with a clenched fist. The repetition of individual arms forms an impression of a continuous golden suspension bridge, rising and falling above the viewer. Like Kwok, Kino turned to the process of casting to create an indexical object that is also widely recognizable as an icon, the raised fist of Olympic athlete Tommy Smith. Smith and his fellow 200-meter sprinter John Carlos astounded the world when they raised a black-fisted glove in protest during their medal ceremony in the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City. The image of this protest has become an iconic symbol of resistance and Black power in the tumultuous year of 1968 and beyond. In its adoption of the most famous individual iteration of the raised Black Power fist, Kino's Untitled Bridge represents a very recognizable, almost overdetermined symbol of resistance. Like most Americans, Kino had long been familiar with the popular image of Smith and Carlos's act of resistance. To make this work, Kino invited Smith to his Los Angeles studio, where they made a cast of the runner's arm. And with this cast of Smith's actual arm, the work also maintains the complexity of the index, encouraging us to reflect on this individual experience. The act of making the cast from Smith's arm in 2013 creates a compelling relation to time and indexicality. Rather than attempt to freeze the original moment of the 1968 protest, it materialized through a reenactment in the 21st century, a contemporary object looking back to the past. As Kino's description of it claimed, quote, "It is a golden path leading forward from the present, but connected to the past, a spectacular reconciliation of the historic record and individual memory, and a public symbol, all renegotiated in an infrastructure of time to create the stories of the now," end quote. The continuity and repetition embodied in Untitled Bridge reflect how racism and police brutality that spurred both Smith and Carlos's original protest continue to today, but a reality that spurred Kino's desires to revisit Smith's action through his work. In this sense, the repetition of the Thyssen Bridge is a bridge across time, connecting the 1960s to the present and suggesting the continuity as well as resistance. The accumulation of arms also reflect the ways in which images, like histories, repeat themselves and encourage viewers to consider their place in this repeated arc of history. In terms of representation through monumental sculpture, Bridge purposefully probes for alternatives to the singular hero narratives often portrayed in public sculpture. Kino posits positions Smith's fist onto its side, suggesting an outstretched hand or a punching fist, both primed for functional action. It resists the triumphant rhetoric of the monument as an architectural form, a suspended bridge. It turns toward the audience, offering a means to move, and at least symbolically. As viewers interact below it, they become very aware of their relation to space and history. Similar to Kino's bridge, the shape of power creates a bridge across time, by tracing a history of debate around representation through sculpture across the centuries of this nation's history. Throughout this history, artists develop strategies to challenge and probe an enduring visual archive of race and representation to create new, complicated expressions of identity. Yet this history requires a critical and perspicacious audience, in addition to the criticality of the engaged artists. And these works invite viewers to hone their skills of interpretation in order to recognize deeper complexities of expression and identity. This history of representation introduces a longer arc to the recent debates around recognition and presence in the public sculpture, and shows how artists have developed critical and complex alternatives to now defunct modes of representation. Thank you. So,
Thank you so much, Tobias. So we have a little time for questions, and I'm actually going to take the moderator's prerogative. So thank you so much for sharing these wonderful artworks and the story of the show. I wonder if you could speak to, as you were installing the show, were there any juxtapositions or visual conversations that emerged that maybe surprised you?
yeah, I've included some images. Let me see if I can get to. What's interesting is when we were installing the works. Um, Oops, I'm going the wrong way. Um, when we were designing and as they existed mostly in that digital form before they all started coming together, and we were definitely imagining within the galleries some of the engagements. The idea is that many of the works would be in conversation with one another within the gallery spaces, but what was really kind of powerful is some of the conversations that would happen across at least our conceived spaces. And it's difficult because actually I don't think that any of these are all pretty tight images. Um, but for example, there's this really wonderful moment when, if you're in home, and I'll just go, there's a space that is looking at domestic sculpture, and if you turn around, there's this wall that is wallpapered and includes um, this kind of totem pole figure that has been appropriated by the artist Nicholas Galanin. And if you look past him, you see a kind of incredible monumental sculpture of Dying Tecumseh, rendered by Ferdinand Petrick. And so there's this really interesting dialogue that happens, that you see this historical work that is this image of Tecumseh dying, and then you see this contemporary work, and both of them really are these like imagined indigenous uh, ideas of Indian, right? That get juxtaposed against one another, and I think that there are these very long shots that happen. There's also, you could stand and look and see a piece called by Raven Half Moon, that on the back of it says, on the back of this work, it says, "Do you speak Indian?" And Half Moon is really interrogating this idea of like who is supposed to represent indigeneity and like authenticity. And you can see both the imaginary Indian, the dying Tecumseh, and Raven Half Moon's work, like all in dialogue with one another, all kind of undoing each other in these really dynamic and interesting ways. And so yeah, that one for me was particularly like, oh, we didn't know that was going to happen. And I think even like there were other moments, even within a space. We have one space in it that, and sorry, I'm like clicking around, but this I think worked particularly well, where we have Sanford Bigger's uh, chimera figure, that, and on the sides of them, you can kind of see Hiram Powers's Greek Slave, one of the most famous American works of American art from the 19th century, and Edmonio Lewis's Hagar. And so the way that these three are in dialogue is really kind of dynamic. But then right by it, kind of almost towering above the chimera figure by Biggers, is Hiram Powers' America. And so there's these works just like, it seems like they're just hanging out and talking to each other in a lot of really interesting ways. That's one of the things I think sculpture tends to do, right? So yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. I wonder if there are any questions from the audience. Yes, down here in front. Ah, yes, there they are. Hello.
Hi. Yeah, I was just wondering if you could talk a little about how this curatorial process was perhaps different, since you were curating for an extremely large national museum that, you have to think about the average American and things like that. So I was just wondering if you could talk about that maybe in conjunction with like some of your past curatorial experiences.
Well, I think my past curatorial experience is pretty much limited to university gallery type spaces, right? And it was very different, of course. What was really kind of unique about this project, I think, especially even for Sam, tends to have a singular curator that is the author. And Karen Lemmy, who is the curator of sculpture, had already begun to think about this project, and begin to think about like the need to create an exhibition about sculpture. Her area of expertise is especially like 19th century, and she convened a meeting of scholars in 2019, that I was one of them. This is before I was brought on as a co-curator, and so as this convening, we began to talk about like, is this a conceivable, or is this a viable exhibition? And from that, she created a scholarly council that included, I want to say 9, but I might be getting that wrong. Scholars all from across American art history, essentially. And we discussed the ideas. This was over the pandemic. It was 2020 and 2021. And we began to discuss this idea of the exhibition. And by the end of that convening, I was invited to be a co-curator along with Grace Yasamura. And so the idea of even having 3 curators for a place like Sam was unusual. And one of the things that we were very, I think, interested in was making sure that we continued that idea of like including many voices, many perspectives. The interpretation team is also at SAM or in many larger institutions, the interpretation kind of joins at the end of the curatorial project. The curators come up with the idea, they kind of set up working with the exhibition designer and create an exhibition. And then the interpretation team comes to help them, like, okay, this is how you should make sure it's accessible to the public. But I think Karen had a great foresight of inviting the interpretation team very early on. And so from the very beginning, we were in conversation of like, how do we center viewers in telling this story, right? And so I think that helped it be a very different exhibition in a lot of ways. And I think it has a lot to do with this idea of like working very collaboratively. And we were able to, secure funding to convene other community engaged uh, panels, right, or advisory panels for interpretation with the students at Howard and GMU. And so all of those steps, I think, really added layers to what we could do, yeah. Thanks for that question.
Thank you so much for a fascinating talk. I have something a little more philosophical and less practical to ask about your engagement with recognition. I found it fascinating. And would love to hear you riff more about how the concept of recognition helps you see the art that you work on. And I say that as someone who's a political philosopher who loves art but isn't in the art world. And so the sort of the shifting definitions of good recognition, bad recognition, how does recognition then sort of shape your view? I would just love to hear more, hear more about that. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was in your title too, so.
Yeah, I know, right? Oh, but to put it in the title, you're asking for it, right? Um, the ways in which I think you probably could tell the ways in which I was kind of invoking recognition kind of shifts a little bit at different moments, because there is the idea of like to be recognized, like publicly as a kind of recognition as a celebration, right? That is kind of what Freeman Murray is thinking about, right? Like we want to be recognized in public space, right? But then there's also that deeper concept of recognition to be seen, right? And to be seen in a way that is embraces a kind of complexity, and that is kind of the recognition that I think is worth encouraging as a kind of um, interpretive and art experiencing enterprise, something that we should be able to, like in a curatorial context, try to provide a frame for the possibility of recognizing within the sculpture the deep complexities of its creation and its existence within the structure of the museum and within the structure of the society that is embracing it as an artwork, right? But also like the idea that if using this kind of theory of interpolation where like one recognizes themselves as subject to a system of power, like there's also a self-recognition that happens, right, in recognizing the other or recognizing the work of art. And so that's kind of what I was trying to play around with this idea of recognition, like that there are deep um subject, like at the process of becoming subject, right? That works in this idea of recognizing a sculpture, but also recognizing oneself in relation to it. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Do you have a hand right down here in the front?
Hi, Tobias.
Hi.
Um, Thank you so much for the talk today. So recently, the current administration released a statement that calls out this exhibition explicitly in its attack, in the current administration's attack on DEI, particularly at the Smithsonian Institution. I was curious to hear your thoughts on that extraordinary response, as well as the SAM's take on that.
I'm going to jump in and say there are some aspects of that question that are better directed to Lonnie Bunch as the head of the Smithsonian, but I know Tobias will speak to that as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely, I'm as a guest curator, right? Like I can't necessarily, I don't represent Sam or the Smithsonian. I think that and this is a way of like kind of not answering your question, and I'm not going to answer your question if that makes sense. But I do think that it's a very, that executive order was certainly galvanizing for the audiences. I think lots of people have showed up to have conversations about what is going about the exhibition, right? To think about like, okay, if there's a call for truth, and I forget what the rest of, but like where is truth to be found, right? I think in a lot in the exhibition, I think there's quite a bit of truth to be found there, and I think that's the work that we're working to make happen. And I think you could read a lot of the responses. There's been a lot of wonderful media response to it, really unpacking the ways in which the ideas of the exhibition, even those that are quoted in that particular executive order, um, are really, really kind of hold their own weight, right? I stand by. I'm very proud of the work that we were able to do, and I think it holds its own. And I'm really proud of the art and the artists that trusted us with their work. And yeah, that's my way of not answering your question. I'm sorry.
I might just follow up on that. I was really struck with the bridge piece. You said that it's resisting the monumental, and I wonder if it even changed over the course of the show. It's this concept of resisting the monumental at the moment when there is a call for the return of certain monuments.
Yeah. I mean, and it's interesting because what I love about it, as I don't know, I'm going the wrong way, um, as a work, it resists the monumental in that it's like, so it is the cast of one body, right? And so in some ways there's still the use of the individual as an emblem or whatever, but mostly it's like this multiple, this multitudinous, like um presence in a way, that doesn't work in that kind of like individual, like this is going to stand um as a monument to all of us, that kind of thing. It doesn't really work that way. It doesn't seem to make that assertion. And I think that's where it kind of resists the monumental in a way. But yet it also incorporates so much like really interesting and powerful history, um, and layers of history that I think are really powerful. Um, yeah, I think in so many ways it's interesting to look at, and I think I was exercising a lot of the ways in which the desire for uh, the community or the national body or whatever to be represented in a single individual tends to not work. You know what I mean? Or it tends to eventually come apart. And so in some ways, looking to other modes, whether it be something like this, or something like the Vietnam War Memorial by Maya Lin, like those kinds of works seem to have a little bit more of an enduring notion of like of the memorial or the monument, right? Or more, I don't know. I just like them more, I guess. Uh,
I think we have time for one more question. All the way in the back, there's a hand raised. Thank you, Julia.
Getting your
Getting
steps.
your steps in,
Yeah.
exactly.
And their steps.
Because I hate microphones. Um, I'm curious because there were a couple of works in the exhibition that were works that were publicly exhibited, or they were maquettes for things that had been publicly exhibited either at the Capitol itself. And those were very interesting to me because obviously the government recognizes the evolution of ideology and philosophies that have um, driven the forces of government either from manifest destiny into other spaces. So I'm curious because are these actually in the holdings of SAM, these maquettes and monuments? I was curious about other works that may not have made it into the exhibition, but that you were surprised to find that was in the repository of the SAM.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because to Sam, one of the reasons why this exhibition, about American sculpture, was important, why Karen really wanted to have it at SAM, is because it does have one of the largest collections of American sculpture. So there are many, 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 examples that aren't on display. And in early iterations of the exhibition, as it was being thought through, um, you could have had a march of endless, I think the other day, Karen was saying, like the trope of the Indian princess right there. You could have had so many Indian princesses, right? Because that was just a real obsession in American sculpture. But I think through discussion with advisory councils and others, um, and I think, we eventually realized like what good is presenting this over and over and over again, right? Showing all of the possible examples. That would have been like a purely 19th century show, and we probably wouldn't have been able to fit anything else in there, right? So we were very kind of uh, particular in choosing which examples, and the question of like whether to show images of violence at all was also something that we really had to be very mindful of. And I think um, this particular example, the Dying Tecumseh by Fernand Petrick behind me, is a great example because it is an image of someone in the midst of dying, right? And it was indeed a work that it was it, just to give you my spiel. This is a work that was uh, represents Tecumseh, who was a famous Shawnee leader who was organizing a pan-indigenous resistance to the United States expansion in the beginning of the 19th century. He eventually joined forces with the British in the War of 1812 and was like a major, major threat, right, to the U.S. Of course, the War of 1812 is when, Washington, D.C. was set on fire by the British, right? And eventually he was killed in a battle in 1813. And actually someone who was later running for vice president, Richard Johnson, was someone who claimed, there were several people who claimed to have killed him, but he claimed to have killed him. And Patrick actually had a smaller scale rendering of this that Johnson actually put on display while he was running for president. So already before it was realized, it was a part of a kind of political narrative, right, that he was trying to create. Once the work was finished, it was put on display in the U.S. Capitol building. So through the administration of Lincoln, it was on display as people were, Congress were walking past it to make and break treaties with the indigenous sovereign nations. So it was really interestingly central to, and this is official spaces, right? So it was an important work mobilized in official spaces. And if those who have taken Art 101, right, might recognize the way in which this invokes the dying Gaul, the Roman work that was rendering, the Gaul in the midst of dying, that was kind of celebrating the imperial powers of Rome. And here, the United States renders Tecumseh in this state of perpetual dying, expressing the imperial aspirations of the United States, right? And thereby controlling through its reproduction the image of indigenous people, right? And what's interesting too, though, is that this eventually was, after it was in the state capitol, it was given over to the Smithsonian and the Smithsonian Institution, which eventually became, or part of it became the SAM, the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And it was placed in display alongside these beautiful Thomas Moran paintings, kind of invoking this idea of manifest destiny, right? Really kind of working together, working with the ideology that is at work originally with the sculpture. And so we wanted to kind of present it in this space in a way that, and it was, on display at SAM, and it has kind of been on display kind of a lot, like I can't remember. I think it was actually moved from galleries into this gallery, right? So I could be wrong, and I think
No, it's been on view
it's been
pretty
on
much continuously, yeah.
it's one of the iconic pieces in the collection, but very rarely does its curatorial framing encourage people to think critically about like how it's working and why it's working, and the narrative of American art and American history that Sam has produced in that space. And so we use this as an opportunity to think a little bit, like look at the history of display. The exhibition in some ways is also thinking a little bit about Sam's relation to its own collection, right? In a way that I think a lot of museums have been doing. And again, I'm a guest curator, so I'm not officially saying the same as, but like I think that there is this opportunity really to reflect critically on these works in that way.
I think that's a wonderful note to conclude. Thank you so much for coming, and please join me in thanking our speaker.